On the 19th of August 1942, deep within the oppressive jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company was chronicling in his diary the profound shock that rippled through so many Japanese soldiers as they first confronted American forces. Through a suffocating canopy of palm trees and ensnaring vines, Imi, alongside 916 other soldiers from Colonel Kona Ichiki's detachment, had just disembarked from destroyers, executing a nighttime insertion that the Japanese High Command confidently believed was the first move to reclaiming Henderson Field. They had been assured the American presence was a mere 2,000 men, poorly disciplined, quick to fear, and softened by lives of ease. Colonel Ichiki himself had arrogantly waved off suggestions to wait for more men. "They are only Americans," he proclaimed to his officers. "We will sweep them into the ocean before dawn." What these battle-tested veterans of China and Southeast Asia could not possibly fathom was that they were on the verge of confronting something entirely without precedent in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was not just the idea of defeat, a concept already inconceivable to soldiers who had known relentless victory since 1937, but a methodical dismantling of every tactical belief, every strategic principle, and every ideological pillar that formed the very foundation of the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself would be turned into a weapon by the Americans. The darkness, which Japanese forces had commanded as their own domain since the war began, would become a treacherous stage for their demise. And the staggering American superiority in equipment, coordination, and raw destructive power would utterly shatter the myth of Japanese supremacy in close-quarters combat. This dramatic reversal had its roots 2 weeks prior on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division had stormed the beaches at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift's Leathernecks were carrying out Operation Watchtower, the inaugural American offensive of the Pacific War. Their mission appeared deceptively simple on paper: seize the nearly finished Japanese airfield, forge a defensive perimeter, and hold that ground until relieved. In truth, they were about to plunge into the longest and most savage campaign in the Marine Corps' history to that date, set in an environment that would push the limits of human endurance to their absolute breaking point. The island was a manifestation of a tropical inferno. Guadalcanal measured 90 miles in length and 25 miles in width, its interior a landscape of mountains soaring 8,000 feet into a constant shroud of clouds. The coastal plain, where Henderson Field was situated, was a treacherous ribbon of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle so dense it could reduce visibility to a matter of feet. The heat was a suffocating blanket, with humidity that never fell below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men could not help but breathe them in. The rivers and streams, which appeared clear and inviting on reconnaissance photos, were teeming with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would ultimately incapacitate more men than all the enemy's actions. Yet, on that initial morning, the Marines discovered the airfield was virtually unguarded. The 2,200 Japanese construction personnel and 600 naval troops had vanished into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and, most crucially, the airfield itself. By the evening of August 8th, American engineers were already diligently working to finish the runway. They christened it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator lost at Midway. Within a few days, the first planes would touch down, and the island would give birth to what history would forever know as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese reaction was both immediate and devastating for the American naval contingent. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa expertly guided 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the blackness in a stunning surprise assault. The Battle of Savo Island would be recorded as the single worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. 4 heavy cruisers, the USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra, were plunged to the ocean floor in less than 1 hour. Over 1,000 sailors perished in the fiery waters. The remaining Allied naval ships retreated, taking with them the majority of supplies that had not yet made it to shore. The Marines were now stranded, isolated, and left to confront a reinforced enemy with scarcely half their equipment and provisions. What the Japanese High Command failed to comprehend in those early August days was the absolute centrality of Henderson Field. Dominance over the airfield translated to dominance over the surrounding waters during daylight. Aircraft launching from Henderson could target any Japanese vessel within a 200-mile radius. This one unalterable fact would shape the entire course of the campaign. The Japanese could command the night, ferrying in soldiers and supplies on swift destroyers, in what became famously known as the Tokyo Express. But the moment dawn broke, the skies belonged to American planes. The strategic imperative for Japan was to recapture Henderson Field without delay, before the Americans could dig in and fortify their hold. Imperial General Headquarters entrusted this mission to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, headquartered in Rabaul. Hyakutake's available forces were limited. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was stationed in Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The nearest available unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been positioned near Guam, originally slated for the Midway operation that was aborted following the naval catastrophe in June. Colonel Kona Ichiki was an instructor from the infantry school, carrying a reputation as a brilliant tactician. He was also infamous for his impulsiveness and an unshakable faith in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American material strength. Before his departure from Truk to Guadalcanal, Ichiki was given explicit instructions to wait for the remainder of his regiment before launching an assault to reclaim the airfield. But Ichiki held American soldiers in very low esteem. He had pored over reports from China, the Philippines, and every theater where Japanese forces had clashed with Western troops. They were undisciplined. They crumbled under duress. They were no match for Japanese warriors in the crucible of close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first echelon to Taivu Point, located 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing proceeded flawlessly, completely escaping the notice of American forces. Ichiki wasted no time in dispatching reconnaissance patrols to gauge the enemy's numbers and defensive layout. It was a standard tactical move that would seal his fate. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was advancing along the coastal trail toward Coley Point when they made contact with Japanese soldiers. The two groups clashed in a swift and brutal firefight. The Marines eliminated 31 Japanese soldiers and seized documents that unveiled the presence of a substantial enemy force in the vicinity. Even more critically, the captured papers revealed that the Japanese were severely misjudging American strength. Captain Brush hurried back to the perimeter with his vital intelligence. General Vandergrift instantly grasped what was unfolding. A Japanese attack was imminent, likely to come from the east. He commanded Colonel Clifton Cates to fortify the defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines had dubbed the Tenaru River. It was, in fact, the Ilu River, but this misnomer would persist in all future historical records. Cates assigned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines to positions along the riverbank, with machine guns strategically placed to blanket the sandbar with interlocking fields of fire. What transpired next would be etched into history as one of the most lopsided victories in the annals of the Marine Corps. Colonel Ichiki, choosing not to wait for reports from his missing patrol or for his reinforcements to arrive, resolved to strike at once. On the night of August 20th, stretching into the early hours of August 21st, he commanded a frontal assault aimed directly across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine placed immense faith in the supremacy of spiritual power and aggressive nighttime assaults to overwhelm an enemy's firepower. Ichiki was convinced his veterans could shatter the American defenses through pure audacity and the close-quarters combat where Japanese soldiers, with their bayonets and grenades, were unparalleled. Shortly after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped his Japanese captors after enduring hours of torture, staggered into the Marine lines bearing a warning. The Japanese were on their way. Moments later, the onslaught began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged headlong across the sandbar, their battle cries piercing the night as they fired rifles and lobbed grenades. They ran straight into a meticulously prepared killing zone. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns erupted. These weapons, honed to perfection during World War I, were the uncelebrated champions of Marine firepower. Each gun was capable of sustaining a rate of 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, provided its water jacket remained full. The Marines had arranged them in mutually supporting emplacements, ensuring that no inch of the sandbar was left uncovered. Japanese soldiers were cut down in successive waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Any who managed to traverse the sandbar were met by 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds, essentially massive shotgun shells that turned men into shredded remains. The assault raged for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the relentless machine gun fire. A few reached the Marine positions, sparking desperate hand-to-hand struggles. Marines fought back with rifles, knives, fists, and any object they could grab. But the defensive preparations held firm. The interlocking fields of fire thwarted any chance of a Japanese breakthrough. As dawn began to break, Colonel Ichiki's attack had ground to a complete and bloody halt. Over 800 of his men were either dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow waters. Daylight offered no reprieve for the surviving Japanese. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack, deploying elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across the sandbar and began to systematically hunt down the Japanese soldiers who had sought refuge in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from a Marine position, vividly described the spectacle. It was a mesmerizing sight to see them maneuvering among the trees, pivoting, turning, and spitting sheets of yellow flame. We hadn't grasped just how many Japanese were in the grove. Group after group was flushed from cover and mown down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was concluded. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Around 128 survivors, primarily from support units positioned near the landing site, vanished back into the jungle. They would transmit a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters, reporting the utter disaster. Among the fallen was Colonel Ichiki himself, although accounts of his death vary. The official Japanese narrative stated he burned his regimental colors and then performed ritual suicide. Some eyewitnesses maintained he died while leading one final desperate charge. Marine casualties were about 40 killed and wounded. The psychological blow to the surviving Japanese soldiers was immense. Captured documents and post-war testimonies spoke of the sheer shock of learning that an entire regiment had been wiped out in a single night. The Americans had not behaved as Japanese doctrine had foretold. They did not succumb to panic during a night attack. They did not buckle when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had held their prepared positions, lured the Japanese into killing zones, and then systematically annihilated them with a torrent of concentrated firepower. The most crushing revelation emerged from the examination of captured gear and the assessment of the battlefield. The Americans wielded a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had utterly failed to anticipate. The Browning machine guns never malfunctioned, never overheated beyond their design limits, and never failed due to poor maintenance or a lack of spare parts. It seemed every single Marine carried more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support the Marines could summon was beyond anything the Japanese could field, and the seamless coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships at sea represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never before faced. Within days of the Tenaru catastrophe, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated a massive naval operation to back the next attempt to seize Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships set out from Truk on August 16th, bearing the remaining 1,400 soldiers of Ichiki's regiment, along with 500 naval Marines. Following the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons, which resulted in severe damage to one of the transports, the Japanese command decided to abandon the use of slow transport ships altogether. In their place, they would employ destroyers for what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, a variety of destroyers and light cruisers delivered nearly 5,000 troops of Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express proved to be a brilliantly effective method for transporting men. Destroyers could complete the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, thereby minimizing their vulnerability to American air attacks. But this method possessed a fatal flaw. Heavy equipment could not be moved this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and, most critically, sufficient food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical constraint would ultimately seal the fate of every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only the gear they could carry on their backs. They were forced to rely on local foraging and whatever scant supplies could be smuggled through the American lines. As the campaign intensified, Japanese troops would find themselves battling not only American firepower, but starvation itself. General Kawaguchi designated September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His strategy involved a three-pronged attack. One force would advance from the west along the coast. A second force would strike from the south, hacking through dense jungle to hit what Japanese intelligence assessed as the most vulnerable section of the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would spearhead the main thrust from the south, advancing along an inland ridge that offered a commanding view of Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi was unaware of was that Marine intelligence had already pinpointed this very ridge as the most probable route of attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, had led a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and uncovered vast supply depots, signaling that a large Japanese force was massing in the area. Edson instantly deciphered the Japanese strategy. They would approach from the south, using the ridge as their main avenue. Edson requested authorization to set up a defensive line on the ridge itself. General Vandergrift gave his approval. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the length of the ridge. He chose his defensive positions with the same methodical precision that had defined the Tanaru defenses, with machine guns placed to create interlocking fire, mortar crews pre-sighted on likely attack routes, and artillery from the 11th Marines plotting defensive fire missions. Every single advantage offered by the terrain and available firepower was meticulously calculated and prepared. The ridge was a narrow spine of coral, about 1,000 meters long, comprising 3 distinct hills blanketed with kunai grass and a scattering of trees. Deep, heavily wooded, and in some spots impassable ravines flanked both sides. It was the ideal terrain for a nighttime infiltration by infantry. It was also, if defended correctly, a perfect killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces launched their assault. Unlike Ichiki's direct frontal charge, this was a more intricate attack. Japanese infantry crept through the ravines on both flanks of the ridge, striving to envelop the American positions. Small units probed for weaknesses. When they located one, larger forces would concentrate for a breakthrough attempt. The fighting was ferocious and chaotic. In the pitch-black darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves in desperate hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had managed to infiltrate to within grenade-throwing distance. Yet the defensive preparations held. Whenever Japanese forces massed for a breakthrough, Marine mortars and artillery rained down, shattering their formations. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds that night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine lines that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed a menacing red in the dark. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything they could wield. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tanaru attack, moved along the lines, bolstering the Marines' spirits and pointing out Japanese infiltration paths. Sergeant John Basilone commanded a machine gun position that became absolutely vital to the defense. When his gun crews were either killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing the weapon alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attackers. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to achieve a breakthrough, but Kawaguchi still had more troops at his disposal and was preparing to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Vandergrift dispatched reinforcements, increasing the total defending force to around 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were waiting with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night of fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi hurled his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements could make the position unbreachable. Japanese soldiers charged again and again, dying by the hundreds in the hailstorm of machine gun fire. Some attacks reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped cold. At one point, the situation grew so dire that Edson himself seized a rifle and joined the firing line. But once more, American firepower and meticulous defensive planning carried the day. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely disintegrated. Japanese casualties were staggering, approximately 830 to 850. Japanese soldiers perished on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties amounted to roughly 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge, which would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, had become a testament to the brutal effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle delivered another profound shock to their understanding of war. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently echoed the same dawning realization. Japanese forces had anticipated a fight against other infantrymen in the dark, where their superior training and spirit were meant to prevail. Instead, they were met by artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all brought to bear with a precision they could not hope to match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They had prepared killing zones. They waited for the Japanese forces to enter, and then they obliterated them with coordinated fire support. The battles at the Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set a pattern that would be repeated throughout the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would initiate attacks fueled by courage, night tactics, and expertise in close combat. American forces would counter with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions meticulously designed to maximize their strengths. The result was grimly predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic, while American casualties, though significant, would be sustainable. But raw numbers failed to capture the sheer horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself transformed into an impartial weapon of death. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would record over 8,000 cases of malaria. Tropical diseases would sideline approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was a universal affliction. Men were plagued by fungal infections that ate away at their skin. Jungle rot created open sores that refused to heal in the humid air. Untreated dental issues led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even more terribly. Their logistical situation meant they had inadequate food from the very start. Soldiers were supposed to be issued field rations, but the Tokyo Express could seldom deliver enough. Men were forced to survive on whatever they could find in the jungle, supplemented by sporadic rice deliveries that had to be stretched to impossible lengths. Starvation became their constant shadow. Medical supplies were practically non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out almost immediately and was never properly restocked. Wounded soldiers frequently died from infections that would have been simple to treat with the right medicine. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a ghastly portrait of their conditions. A medical officer's report from late October stated that over 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had plummeted to perhaps 30% of their authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, with most succumbing to starvation and disease rather than combat injuries. American supply ships, shielded by Henderson Field's aircraft during the day, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. There were shortages, especially in August and early September when naval defeats left the Marines temporarily isolated, but these were fleeting. By October, the flow of supplies had become steady. Marines ate canned rations that, while unpalatable, provided sufficient calories and nutrition. Ammunition was so abundant that machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore out, and then simply request new ones. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical units, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfa drugs to combat infection, and the eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear-area hospitals. Japanese logistics, in contrast, consisted of whatever could be transported on destroyer decks or smuggled through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single ball of rice last for an entire day. Ammunition was conserved so strictly that orders often forbade firing unless it was absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if one was fortunate, amputation without anesthesia if not, or death if a wound became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given a grenade and left behind to commit suicide rather than become a burden to their units or face capture. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself arrived on Guadalcanal to personally oversee the operation. He brought with him elements of the 2nd Division, including troops with extensive experience from China. The plan involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main thrust coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, the Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and the artillery support that had finally been delivered by destroyers. The offensive commenced on October 23rd with a preliminary strike from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, a rarity on Guadalcanal due to the difficulty of transporting them, spearheaded an assault across the Meticulously River. The American defenders, which included elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division, were prepared. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank swiftly knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks. The attack crumbled with severe casualties. The primary assault occurred on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, aiming to rupture the American lines south of Henderson Field. They were met by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps lore. Japanese attacks came in relentless waves throughout the night. Any individual breakthroughs were immediately sealed off by counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons gave out, then they grabbed rifles and kept fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that impacted just yards from the Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington was on standby, prepared to provide naval gunfire support if needed. At one critical juncture, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese forces and Henderson Field, but they refused to break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, once again proved crucial to the defense. When ammunition for his machine gun section ran low, Basilone personally hauled ammunition through enemy fire to keep his guns in action. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire. When one gun position was overrun, he drew a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that successfully restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had been utterly defeated. General Nasu was dead, cut down by machine gun fire during one of the night assaults. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives in the attempt to break through. American casualties numbered several hundred killed and wounded. Severe, but sustainable. October 1942 also witnessed major naval battles that decisively tipped the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, which raged over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, featured some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a chaotic nighttime brawl on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only two American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, perished in the action. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more destroyers damaged, but the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, which was disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the next day. More importantly, the bombardment mission was a failure. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment, but was intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating exhibition of American radar-directed gunnery, the Washington slammed 9 16-inch shells into the Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely discern their target. The Kirishima sank with a heavy loss of life. Perhaps most crucially, American aircraft and surface ships decimated a Japanese convoy that was attempting to land the 38th Division with its heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 made it to Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could finish unloading. Japanese casualties from the convoy disaster exceeded 5,000 men. This marked the last serious effort to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For the Japanese troops already on the island, November signaled the beginning of the end. They had been anticipating reinforcements and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had been lost, the convoys were destroyed, and no more help was coming. Rations were cut yet again. Already starving men were instructed to survive on even less. Medical supplies, which had been critically low, became non-existent. The sick and wounded crowded into makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do little more than watch them die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period paint a picture of a slow, agonizing collapse. Entries described rice rations being reduced to a single ball per day, disease spreading uncontrollably, and bodies being burned when soldiers had the strength. A dawning realization set in that no more supplies were coming. Men resorted to eating grass and bark, with deaths from poisonous plants becoming common, as soldiers deteriorated into desperate, starving shadows of their former selves. December brought the final reckoning. The Japanese command in Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. While they could not publicly admit defeat, they privately understood that continuing the operation would mean the complete annihilation of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers were left on the island, down from a peak of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were still fit enough to walk. The remainder were sick, wounded, or so debilitated by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, codenamed Operation K, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Utilizing destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces managed to extract 10,052 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was an impressive feat under challenging conditions, but it could not mask the sheer scale of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 perished, with about 14,800 killed in combat and another 10,000 to 15,000 lost to disease and starvation. American casualties were also heavy but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could easily replace these losses. New divisions were already in training. Ships and aircraft were being manufactured faster than they could be destroyed. The strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking cannot be overstated. For the very first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every single offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring horrific conditions shattered all pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently highlighted several key themes. First, they had completely misjudged American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far more vast than their intelligence had ever suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled both the sea and the air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient to overcome systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans offered a consistent assessment. They had believed themselves to be superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, and had mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that modern war is decided by systems. The Americans had a system for everything: for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. And every one of these systems functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never properly constructed in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that contradicted the official Japanese explanations for their defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. They admitted that Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining their combat effectiveness because their logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion possessed more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical aspects of American superiority were significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons that required manual cycling between each shot. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but these were increasingly supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as it became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic action provided a clear advantage in firefights. The machine gun situation told an even starker story. The American M1917A1 Browning was water-cooled and could maintain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were supplied. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more mobile but lacked the capability for sustained fire. In defensive situations, this difference was decisive. The superiority in artillery was perhaps the most significant factor. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be disassembled and transported through the jungle terrain. These 75mm weapons provided responsive and accurate fire support. Forward observers embedded with infantry units could call in fire missions and have rounds landing within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to maneuver. Through the jungle and chronically short of ammunition, naval gunfire introduced another dimension that Japanese forces could not counter. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver devastating bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio. Communication between shore-based observers and the naval ships enabled precise targeting. Air power grew increasingly dominant as the campaign wore on. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under appalling conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F, Wildcats, P-39 Cobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SBD Dauntless dive bombers relentlessly struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces based in Rabaul had to fly at the absolute limits of their range, which gave them minimal time over the target. The Final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated just how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now composed of both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically crushed the remaining Japanese positions. This offensive was backed by overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, though fierce, was crippled by starvation, disease, and a dire lack of ammunition. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that the Japanese forces had vanished, having been evacuated. General Patch sent his now famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of brutal fighting had culminated in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and unveiled truths that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. The lessons that Japanese survivors carried away from Guadalcanal were devastating to their pre-war military doctrine. The myth of the Japanese warrior's superiority had been utterly shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were proven to be inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the very hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, had failed against prepared American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary matters, but the fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority were the true determinants of outcomes on land. These lessons, learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal, should have triggered a fundamental reform of Japanese military thinking. Some officers did grasp the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its entire strategy. The Americans, he noted, were fighting an industrial war where material production decided the outcome. Japan could not hope to win an industrial war against America's immense productive capacity. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily digest such a fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal placed the blame on inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It failed to acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare which had served Japan so well against China was obsolete when facing a modern industrial adversary. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war, became witnesses to a transformation they had never anticipated. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many would later describe Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans vividly captured this psychological transformation. They acknowledged learning truths that their leaders had concealed. The Americans were not weak but overwhelmingly strong, not just in their weapons, but in their organization, logistics, leadership, and their ability to sustain combat operations. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill, but it did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources that Japanese forces simply could not match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the sheer brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine was proven to work. Combined arms coordination was effective. The individual American soldier, when properly trained and equipped, was more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But the Americans also learned a profound respect for the Japanese soldier as a tough, determined, and skilled adversary who would rather fight to the death than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, and to die rather than retreat, made a lasting impression. The stark contrast between the two sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender highlighted fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender by dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, and offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts met with minimal success. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to offer any resistance. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal reached far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and their eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be breached. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages that America possessed could be translated into military victory if they were applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anything close to the rate at which America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate was a quiet admission that Japan could not sustain a war of attrition against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides would carry their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became the core cadres for new units, passing on hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before it could return to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even bleaker future. Those evacuated during Operation K were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological weight of defeat and the certain knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had ever suggested. Many would perish in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to crumble. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided invaluable case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign proved that modern warfare demanded more than just brave soldiers and tactical skill. It required industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses surpassed 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would plague their health for the rest of their lives. But in military terms, the strategic significance justified the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established the patterns of air and naval superiority that would characterize the remainder of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about the collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of modern warfare. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages, and in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in the systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, and in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality utterly destroyed illusion. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions, that their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war, that their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and that their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. They discovered that they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved to be formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, and relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every engagement. It was a terror born not from the fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from the chilling realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.